I appreciate you're a private citizen now, and I saw you back there working on your statement. So it may just be an oversight that you did not draw attention to the February 23rd, 1998 press conference that Osama bin Laden held in Khost, Afghanistan, and that he with a satellite telephone delivered to an Arabic-speaking newspaper in London. This seems, as I read it, it reads like a declaration of war, and I wonder if that's just an oversight or whether or not you don't believe that that's an important
Senator Kerry, I've watched prior testimony yesterday, and your statements to that on this subject. I believe we were at war with al-Qaeda. Number one, the president sounded the alarm. I have just something for the record here.
But just help me.
Let me answer.
No, actually, before you do that, because I get 5 minutes here, and I know where you're going, and I just, do you regard the 23rd? Do you regard the 23rd February '98 declaration as a strategically important?
Absolutely, the fatwas were terribly important. The document I wanted to show you. This is. It's not like we weren't talking about the terrorism, the Taliban in Afghanistan. We sounded the alarm. Number two, we used all the instruments that we had available to us, whether those were military or covert or otherwise. I think we were at war with the Taliban.
Sandy, I've got 5. I didn't have enough time to compliment you in the way that I would like to have done. But let's presume that I had 15 minutes to deliver compliments about all the things you're doing. I think you're a great strategic thinker. But when this is when your statement doesn't include that,
I only had 10 minutes in my statement.
Okay, but so you regard the 23rd February press conference in Khost, Afghanistan, as a declaration of war against the United States?
I regarded all of the fatwas, I mean, there were several of them, as growing indication that this individual was a strategic lethal threat to the United States.
By late in the evening of September 11th, the president had addressed the nation on the terrible events of the day. Vice President Cheney described the president's mood as somber. The long day was not over yet. When the largest meeting that included his domestic department heads broke up, President Bush chaired a smaller meeting of his top advisors, a group he would later call his War Council. This group usually included Vice President Cheney, Secretary of State Powell, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, General Hugh Shelton, the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Myers, DCI Tenant, Attorney General John Ashcroft, and FBI Director Robert Mueller, from the White House Chief of Staff, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, and Chief of Staff Andrew Card were part of the core group, often joined by their deputies Stephen Hadley and Joshua Bolten. In this restricted National Security Council meeting, the president said it was a time for self-defense. The United States would punish not just the perpetrators of the attacks, but also those who harbored them. Secretary Powell said the United States had to make it clear to Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the Arab states that the time to act was now. He said we would need to build up a coalition. The president noted that the attacks provided a great opportunity to engage Russia and China. Secretary Rumsfeld urged the president and the principals to think broadly about who might have harbored the attackers, including Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Sudan, and Iran. He wondered aloud how much evidence the United States would need in order to deal with these countries, pointing out that major strikes could take up to 60 days to assemble. President Bush chaired 2 more meetings of the National Security Council on September 12th. In the first meeting, he stressed that the United States was at war and a new and different kind of enemy. The president tasked principals to go beyond their pre-9/11 work and develop a strategy to eliminate terrorists and punish those who supported them. As they worked on defining the goals and objectives of the upcoming campaign, they considered a paper that went beyond al-Qaeda to propose the elimination of terrorism as a threat to our way of life, an aim that would include pursuing other international terrorist organizations in the Middle East. Condoleezza Rice chaired the Principals Committee meeting on September 13th in the Situation Room to refine how the fight against al-Qaeda would be conducted. The principals agreed that the overall message should be that anyone supporting al-Qaeda would risk harm. the United States would need to integrate diplomacy, financial measures, intelligence, and military actions into an overarching strategy. The principles also focused on Pakistan and what it could do to turn the Taliban against al-Qaeda. They concluded that if Pakistan decided not to help the United States, it too would be at risk. The same day, Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage met with the Pakistani ambassador to the United States, Melhil Lodhi, and the visiting head of Pakistan's military intelligence service, Mahmoud Ahmed. Armitage said that the United States wanted Pakistan to take 7 steps. 1, to stop al-Qaeda operatives at its border and end all logistical support for bin Laden. 2, to give the United States blanket overflight and landing rights for all necessary military and intelligence operations. 3, to provide territorial access to the United States and allied military intelligence and other personnel to conduct operations against al-Qaeda. 4, to provide the United States with intelligence information. 5, to continue to publicly condemn the terrorist acts. 6, to cut off all shipments of fuel to the Taliban and stop recruits from going to Afghanistan. And 7, if the evidence implicated that bin Laden, al-Qaeda, and the Taliban continued to harbor them, to break relations with the Taliban government. Pakistan made its decision swiftly. That afternoon, Secretary of State Powell announced at the beginning of a National Security Council meeting that Pakistan President Musharraf had agreed to every U.S. request for support in the war on terrorism. The next day, the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad confirmed that Musharraf and his top military commanders had agreed to all 7 demands, that Pakistan will need full U.S. support, and it proceeds with us, the embassy noted. Musharraf said the GOP, the government of Pakistan, was making substantial concessions in allowing use of its territory, that he would pay a domestic price. His standing in Pakistan was certain to suffer. To counterbalance that, he needed to show that Pakistan was benefiting from his decisions. At the September 13th National Security Council meeting, when Secretary Powell described Pakistan's reply, President Bush led a discussion of an appropriate ultimatum to the Taliban. He also ordered Secretary Rumsfeld to develop a military plan against the Taliban. The president wanted the United States to strike the Taliban, step back, wait to see if they got the message, and hit them hard if they did not. He made clear that the military should focus on targets that would influence the Taliban's behavior. President Bush also tasked the State Department, which on the following day delivered to the White House a paper entitled Game Plan for a Political Military Strategy for Pakistan and Afghanistan. The paper took it as a given that bin Laden would continue to act against the United States even while under Taliban control. Paper itself would be important. It therefore detailed specific U.S. demands for the Taliban surrender, and also the surrender of bin Laden and his chief lieutenants, including Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, and would tell the United States what the Taliban knew about al-Qaeda and its operations, close all the terrorist camps, free all imprisoned foreigners, and comply with all United Nations Security Council resolutions. State Department proposed delivering an ultimatum to the Taliban, produce bin Laden and his deputies, and shut down al-Qaeda camps within 24 hours. Or the United States will use all necessary means to destroy the terrorist infrastructure. State Department did not expect the Taliban to comply. Therefore, State and Defense would plan to build an international coalition to go into Afghanistan. Both departments would consult with NATO and other allies and request intelligence, basing, and other support from countries according to their capabilities and resources. Finally, the plan detailed a public U.S. stance. America would use all its resources to eliminate terrorism as a threat, punish those responsible for the 9/11 attacks, hold states and other actors responsible for providing sanctuary on terrorists, work with a coalition to eliminate terrorist groups and networks, and avoid malice toward any people, religion, or culture. President Bush recalled that he quickly realized that the administration would have to invade Afghanistan with ground troops. But the early briefings to the President and Secretary Rumsfeld on military options were disappointing. Tommy Franks, the commanding general of the Central Command, told us at the 9/11 Commission that the president was dissatisfied. The U.S. military, Frank said, did not have an off-the-shelf plan to eliminate the al-Qaeda threat in Afghanistan. The existing infinite resolve option did not, in his view, amount to such a plan. All those diplomatic and military plans were reviewed over the weekend of September 15th and 16th as President Bush conveyed his war council at Camp David. Present were Vice President Cheney, Condoleezza Rice, Stephen Hadley, Colin Powell, Richard Armitage, Donald Rumsfeld, John Ashcroft, Robin Mueller, George Tenet, Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz, and Cofer Black, the head of the DCI's Counterterror Center. Tenet described the plan for collecting intelligence and mounting covert operations. He proposed inserting CIA teams into Afghanistan to work with Afghan warlords who would join the fight against al-Qaeda. These CIA teams would act jointly with the military's special operations units. President Bush later praised this proposal, saying it had been a turning point in his thinking. General Hugh Shelton briefed the principals on the preliminary plan for Afghanistan that the military had put together. It drew on the Infinite Resolve phase campaign plan the Pentagon had been developing in November of 2000 as an addition to the strike operation it had been refining since 1998. But Shelton added a new element, the possible significant use of ground forces, and that is where President Bush reportedly focused his attention. After hearing from his senior advisors, President Bush discussed with Rice the contents of the directives he would issue to set all the plans into motion. Rice prepared a paper that President Bush then consolidated and considered with principals on Monday morning, which was September 17th. The purpose of the meeting, he recalled saying, is to assign tasks for the first wave of the war against terrorism. It starts today. In a written set of instructions slightly refining during the morning meeting, President Bush charged R. Ashcroft, Mueller, and Tenet to develop a plan for homeland defense. President Bush directed Secretary of State Powell to deliver an ultimatum to the Taliban along the lines that his department had originally proposed. The State Department also tasked to develop a plan to stabilize Pakistan, to be prepared to notify Russia and other countries near Afghanistan when hostilities were imminent. In addition, Bush and his advisors discussed new legal authorities for covert action in Afghanistan, including the administration's first memorandum of notification on bin Laden. Shortly thereafter, President Bush authorized broad new authorities for the CIA. President Bush instructed Rumsfeld and Hugh Shelton to develop further the Camp David military plan to attack the Taliban and al-Qaeda if the Taliban rejected the ultimatum. The president also tasked Donald Rumsfeld to ensure that robust measures to protect American military forces against terrorist attacks were implemented worldwide. Finally, he directed Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill to craft a plan to target al-Qaeda's funding and seize its assets. National Security Council staff members have begun leading meetings on terrorist fundraising by September 18th. Also, by September 18th, Powell had contacted 58 of his foreign counterparts and received offers of general aid, search and rescue equipment, and personnel, and even medical assistant teams. On the same day, Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage was called by Mahmoud Ahmed regarding a 2-day visit to Afghanistan, during which the Pakistani intelligence chief had met with Mullah Omar and conveyed the U.S. demands. Taliban leader Omar's response was not negative on all these points, but the administration knew that the Taliban was unlikely to turn over bin Laden. The pre-9/11 draft presidential directive on al-Qaeda evolved into a new directive. National Security Presidential Directive 9 was now entitled Defeating the Terrorist Threat to the United States. The directive would now extend to a global war on terrorism, not just on al-Qaeda. It also incorporated the president's determination not to distinguish between terrorists and those who harbor them. It included a determination to use military force, if necessary, to end al-Qaeda's sanctuary in Afghanistan. The new directive, formally signed on October 25th, after the fighting in Afghanistan had already begun, included new material followed by annexes, including each targeted terrorist group. The old draft directive on al-Qaeda became, in effect, the first annex. The United States would strive to eliminate all terrorist networks, dry up their financial support, and prevent them from acquiring weapons of mass destruction. The goal was the elimination of terrorism as a threat to our daily way of life.